And you've been a part of, you're leading the task force to kind of solve this issue within the governor school system in Virginia, and specifically with TJ up in Northern Virginia, Maggie Walker here in Richmond. I'm actually a product of the governor school system down in Roanoke. But is this something where you feel like these policies and the approach that ultimately the governor school system takes is that kind of hoping to lead the way, and how you mentioned Brown versus Board and just the truly ingrained history that we have. How do you go about overcoming that?
Yeah, it's a tough challenge. As a matter of fact, I have a couple of town halls with students from governor schools. This evening is one of them, and surprisingly, students and alumni of the schools are asking for the change. It's the families who are showing resistance, and they're using the same rhetoric that was used during massive resistance. And they get really upset when I say, okay, well, look, this is what you're saying. This was what was said in the 1950s. The evidence is right there. You make what of it. And it's so with COVID, folks who say, well, it's a hoax, right? It's not real. With systemic racism, it's also, which is a disease and we want to diagnose it. If you're in denial that it doesn't exist, then that's the problem, right? That's part of the problem. And that's what we're trying to really have a healthy dialogue about, recognizing that we're all responsible and we're all in it together to think through it collectively. Now, with governor schools, TJ and Maggie Walker, why do you see that there's such a stark difference in the demographics of the schools and the regions they serve compared to other governor schools? But they're not perfect, or other issues is that our gifted programs are fragmented. That's one big part of the problem. I've asked the State Board of Education in the next 2 months, they're going to open up our gifted regulations to make sure that they're equitable and fix them, making sure that we're strengthening our pipeline, diverting our resources accordingly. But going up the chain and looking at these magnet schools where they were intended to be for gifted and talented education, there are students who go to the governor schools who are truly gifted. There are students who are academically superior. There's a big difference. Folks conflate the two. There is a lot of weight given to achievement testing. So there's two types of testing, right? You got achievement testing, you got aptitude testing. So achievement testing is what a student has had exposure to, has learned a lot of knowledge. So they're going to do well on an achievement test. Aptitude tests show a future potential of a student. So even in our gifted programs, as I talk to gifted coordinators and gifted teachers and the directors, they're conflating the two, right? So we have to separate the two. Aptitude tests are not being utilized in consideration, and we haven't developed good aptitude testing. But if you take testing out of the equation, to really understand a student, you have to look at the entire profile of a student. You have to look at their life experiences. What are their communication skills? What are their creative and critical thinking skills? And that you can get a better understanding by actually talking to the teachers who work with the students, 3rd through 8th grade. That's where our gifted programs start. So I don't know why we don't get those recommendations from teachers and get the entire makeup of a student. Talking to the student directly about their experiences, having them write an essay, submit a video, interviewing them. And the reason standardized testing has been used even by our universities and our schools is because the logistical process is too hard, according to them, to really look at the thing holistically. Costs money. But I mean, okay, well, that's not fair. I mean, obviously the system is going to get gamed by those who are well resourced. So we want to, decouple that and do this right. And I'm like, hey, the state is giving you a hefty amount. Let's use a certain percentage to look at a holistic, take a holistic approach, look at the entire profile of a student. And that's how we address these inequities, because there are a lot of Black and Latinx and economically disadvantaged students across these regions who are just, not getting a fair shot. Again, it's about that access, having an opportunity to prove yourself. You're not getting that shot. So it will only make these schools better. We have a very antiquated way ranking agencies rank our schools. I've reached out to them, talked to them. and they're trying to improve their systems and their methodology and their algorithms. Um, all of our elite universities, Harvard, Yale, Berkeley, they've moved on from being heavy tested to test optional, looking at entire profile. Their rankings have not been impacted. Other countries are taking a more holistic approach to their gifted programs, magnet schools. Their rankings are not being impacted. So it's not. It's only going to make TJ and Maggie Walker and our gifted programs in general better if we modernize the way we do our admissions and identify the students who should go there. Um, so that's the thing is, and the one last thing I'll end on is that I'm going to draw a sports analogy. When an athlete uses a performance enhancement drug that's illegal or is frowned upon, right? So with the standardized testing and achievement testing approach, if you're enhancing your performance by getting a lot of extra help, tutoring services and so forth, it changes the dynamic, right? It gives you a complete unfair advantage. Not everybody has those opportunities. And that coupled with the starting line is already different for folks from different economic backgrounds or different racial backgrounds, that really is hurting our education system. And we really have to look at that deeply, look at evidence-based practices and models that are working well, and change those models. So the change is coming to the governor schools. I mean, I hope folks realize that. I just told the folks in a nice way, I'm like, please embrace it. The change is coming. You can be part of the change and help give good advice and have a say, or you can resist and be part of this massive resistance type thing, which, you can roll the dice on that, but the change is going to happen. Because the change is going to happen is because students and alumni want the change. They're the ones driving the change. They're the ones who want it, and there's that's why I remain optimistic, because our young people want this change, and they're not going to rest until the change occurs. They're not going to let me rest. They're not going to let anybody else rest. So
I think that pushback from parents that you mentioned is such an important factor. The end of this summer, and now I've been listening to the podcast Nice White Parents. I'm not sure if you've had a chance in your busy schedule to do that, but it really touches on, the New York City system, and in particular these, charter schools or certain districts, and they touch upon, how the gifted programs there, the school district in NYC is something like 70% students of color, but their gifted and talented program has under 10%. And how do you get that buy-in from white parents that even if, maybe they're voting blue, their argument is usually, well, they don't want to experiment on their own child in this, experiment to diversify schools. And I agree, like resegregation of schools is one of the biggest issues that I'm interested in looking at as a policymaker, and how do we mitigate and get that buy-in. And there's that certain amount of there's like a threshold of, I think the podcast said like 23 white families. If there are 23 other white families at a school, then parents are willing to buy in. So how in your decision making about this, like what kind of studies are you looking at, and are you looking at things like thresholds for buy-in, or is it really just removing that barrier of testing and achievement testing?
Right. Thank you, Megan. It's both, right? So one, the policy change is going to occur. I've told the localities, you have a head start. We gave them when the governor and the General Assembly put the change for governor schools in the budget language last year in the budget, met with the directors and said, look, you have a head start to start developing your diversity goals, starting having these conversations with the community. We'll monitor that. If you can do this on your own, great. If not, the state's coming and we're going to make the change. So that's one. And then asking about your buy-in question, it's not just white parents, right? If you look at it, it's nationally, it's happening is also with Asian American parents as well. Because at TJ, the population is 70% Asian. At Maggie Walker, it's only 25% Asian, but it's growing, right? It's growing. It's 63% white, 25% Asian, and then rest other Black and Hispanic. So it's not, the AAPI parents, your policies are anti-Asian, and the way we get the buy-in is that we have to be very clear. Let's disaggregate the data. No community is monolithic. White community is not monolithic. Asian community is not monolithic. What about the economically disadvantaged whites and AAPIs who are also not getting opportunities, who are getting shut out of the process? Because there's an income stratification at these schools, and it's the really well-resourced families who are benefiting. And why does it happen to be white and Asian? Because that's where there's a concentration of wealth occurring there, and that's the big problem in our society. Is there's a concentration of wealth and there's a concentration of poverty, and that's where it goes back to my original thing, is that if we had more mixed income settings, that's where we'll see a lot of our problems addressed. So it's not necessarily asking for buy-in, but just telling them, hey, this is what the data shows. I know a lot of working class Asian families who are not benefiting, and they've complained about the process because they just don't have the resources to provide the services for their child to gear up for a standardized achievement test, which shows a very limited scope as well. And so we'll face a lot of resistance. Folks will make it an issue. It's happening with Harvard, Yale, Berkeley. These conversations are occurring where folks are rallying, and I've noticed that it's shifted where the Asian parents are being put at the forefront. They're like, oh, we're okay. We're diverse. We got Asians, right? We got our token Asians. So it's disingenuous, right? Is disingenuous and the way it's happening. And that's why I'm like, look, I mean, it's not. And one thing is we have to embrace the fact that for African Americans, I mean, I'm not black or white, right? I'm trying to look at this very objectively. We just have generation after generation after generation of built up systemic racism. It comes in all different forms. You all are well aware of this. And we have to embrace that there's a problem that exists. And we have to be proactive, and all of us address it. It shouldn't just fold on the shoulders of African Americans to talk about systemic racism that they're facing. It's everybody's responsibility. So when I have conversations with my Asian American friends, is like, look, the very freedoms that you enjoy as immigrants or API families, they were done on the sacrifices of a lot of different social justice movements and civil rights movements, generation after generation, that were led by African Americans. And it's easier for you to assimilate, and your experience is very different. So you have to truly understand, what the problem is. It's race and economics compounded, and there's an intersection of two. And we have to ask a question: why is it that African Americans and Hispanics and Latinx Americans tend to be more economically disadvantaged? That doesn't mean that they're not affluent and well-resourced Black and Latinx families, even in Northern Virginia. But if you look at the Northern Virginia demographics, and I know I'm going on and on, but it's good to know the data. So at Thomas Jefferson, for example, the only 2% of the students are on free and reduced lunch, economically disadvantaged. So economically disadvantaged students, according to our definition, is somebody's on free and reduced lunch or their family's on SNAP or TANF and so forth, right? So the region they serve, about 30% of the students are economically disadvantaged. So we disaggregated the data by race. So the ratio for whites is 90-10. So 10% of whites are economically disadvantaged. For AAPI community, it's 80-20. For Blacks, it's 50-50. For Hispanics, it's 35-65. So we have to ask a question: in Northern Virginia, in Fairfax County, that is so well-resourced, why is it that 65% of Latinx and 50% of Blacks are economically disadvantaged? It just doesn't make any sense. Something's not right, So this goes beyond just education. There's issues with affordable housing and wages and so forth. And this is one of the bluest areas, right? So this is when people get really upset. I'm like, look, I mean, talk is cheap. You could put stuff on Facebook and put BLM stuff and try to show your friends that, hey, we care. But what is happening in the policies? So I'll stop there. I'll digress. I know I'm going on and on. I apologize. Yeah.
No, I think that's so important to reinforce your point, and this changing language within the ed policy space, that it's not necessarily an achievement gap, but it's an opportunity gap that is informed by systemic racism, and that they're equally able to achieve as long as they have these resources and opportunities.
Well, Secretary Qarni, I think that's actually a very good place to leave it. And so I want to ask you